Mr. Lincoln goes to Washington. This is a Nation Divided, Part 1. The interregnum, a term used to describe the transition period between heads of state. In this case, we're talking about the transition period between President James Buchanan and President Abraham Lincoln. Post-election, Lincoln said little about future policies. He said even less about past positions, because after all, he had won. He stayed in Springfield, Illinois, his home, until mid-February, and then boarded a train to Washington, D.C. Alerted to a possible assassination attempt in Baltimore, he arrived in Washington, D.C. in secret on February 23rd. Meanwhile, along the way, he told the New Jersey state legislature that he was, quote, devoted to peace, and that, quote, it may be necessary to put the foot down to the impending rebellion. On March 4th, 1861, Lincoln was inaugurated. In his speech, he pledged to not interfere with slavery in the states where it exists, and he emphasized the view that the union of these states is perpetual. So, for the first time in 1861, the Republicans are in power. Lincoln appointed his political rivals to his cabinet. Every one of his secretaries thought they were better than President Lincoln. His Secretary of State is William Seward. His Secretary of the Treasury is Salmon P. Chase. His first Secretary of War is Simon Cameron, and his Attorney General is Edward Bates. Meanwhile, while Lincoln is going to Washington, the Confederates are busy reinforcing the forts in the South that formerly belonged to the Union. And the flashpoint occurs at Fort Sumter, which is in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. The Confederates had circled the fort with a ring of fire. The Union Army, the United States Army, which has refused to leave, led by U.S. Major General Robert Anderson, is running out of supplies because this ring of fire is nothing more than a siege. Lincoln chose to reinforce the fort. Davis, now President of the Confederacy, chose to oppose any effort to reinforce the fort. On April 11th, Confederate General Pierre-Gustave Toussaint Beauregard demanded the surrender. This is the first case of former mentor facing former student, because Beauregard was a pupil of Anderson's at West Point. Anderson refused to surrender to his student, and thus the shelling of Fort Sumter began. On the next day, April 13th, Anderson surrendered. The key thing here is, always keep in mind, in the Civil War, the Confederacy fired the first shot, not the Union. With the news of Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln then takes the initial steps towards war. On April 15th, he asked the remaining loyal states for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. And on the 19th, Lincoln then proclaimed a naval blockade of southern ports. This war proclamation by Lincoln prompted the secession of the Upper South. Virginia seceded on April 17, 1861. Arkansas followed on May 6, 1861. Tennessee on May 7, 1861. North Carolina on May 20, 1861. With the secession of Virginia, the Confederacy moved its capital from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia, and this moved the focus of the war further north. All four of these states that seceded had large areas of pro-Union support. East Tennessee provided more troops for the Union than for the Confederacy. The other slave states remained in the Union. The Unionists in West Virginia, in fact, secede from the state of Virginia and create their own state. West Virginia will be admitted to the Union in 1863. Delaware was pro-Union and had no interest in leaving the Union. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were split, but all three states had substantial slave and free populations. Now, Maryland's an interesting case. If Maryland had seceded, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, would have been surrounded by the Confederacy. Thus, Lincoln has to take extraordinary steps to secure Maryland for the Union. Thus, the first thing Lincoln does is suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus, forces police officers to produce prisoners and to justify their arrests. Now, with suspending the writ of habeas corpus, police officers can now just arrest people and put them in jail. They don't have to produce the prisoners. They don't have to justify their arrest. Thus, Lincoln is able to have the police round up pro-Confederate leaders in Maryland and put them in jail. This would include the governor of Maryland and the mayor of Baltimore. Kentucky harbored divided loyalties, but remained neutral. Missouri, on the other hand, was fought over. After a constitutional convention failed, pro-slavery forces gathered in St. Louis, and they were commanded by the governor of the state. The Unionist forces pushed these guys into southwestern Missouri, and this led to ultimately the Battle of Pea Ridge, or Elkhorn Tavern, on May 6 through 8, 1862, in northwest Arkansas. The Union's victory here ended the official Confederate resistance for Missouri, and the Missouri Confederate government was placed in exile. In fact, they ended up in the town of Marshall, Texas, where they would remain for the remainder of the war. There's much talk about Eastern Theater, Western Theater, and some talk about Eastern Theater being Virginia, the Western Theater being Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, around the Mississippi. Some talk about the Trans-Mississippi Theater, but I want to take a moment to talk about the Far West Theater, the theater the part of the Civil War that was fought in the Mexican Cession, California, Nevada, Utah. Most of the attraction here is gold and silver. There's gold in California, there's silver in Nevada, and these metals attract settlers to the West even during the Civil War. The rest of California became a state, as had Oregon. The rest of the lower 48 achieves territorial status by 1864. Territorial governments have been organized. In 1864, Nevada itself gained statehood. This is the power of silver. Overall, the United States maintained control of this Far West theater during the war, not accepting the fact that the Confederacy didn't try. In fact, Lincoln had to dispatch new units to the West to maintain order, protect gold and silver shipments, and to win over Western political support for the war. There was widespread fighting in Kansas. After all, this is where it really started. If you go back to Bloody Kansas, there was fighting in the Indian Territory and along the Kansas-Missouri border. These are the stories of William Quantrell, a pro-Confederate guerrilla fighter who actually fought under the flag of the pirates. Now, why we want to talk about Quantrell? His followers were mostly teenage boys, such as William Bloody Bill Anderson, Cole Younger, and Frank and Jesse James. Yes, many of your Old West outlaws get their start fighting for the Confederacy under William Quantrell. Quantrell led a raid on Lawrence, Kansas on August 21st, 1863. Quantrell told his followers to kill every male and burn every house. And all be told, 182 boys and men were killed in this raid. And on the way out of town, they robbed the bank. Quantrell's legacy of brutality lives on in his followers, in the actions of Old West outlaws, because according to one author, they honed their skills in this border war. Opposing Quantrell in Kansas is the Jayhawkers. The Jayhawkers tortured and hanged pro-Confederate prisoners. They burned houses and destroyed livestock. And they are, the namesake of the University of Kansas, the Jayhawks. Indian regiments fought on both sides and against each other in Oklahoma. Here's something for you. The 5 civilized tribes owned slaves. The Choctaws and the Chickasaw, who lived in southern Oklahoma, they supported the Confederacy. The Cherokees, the Creeks, the Seminoles, they were divided over whether they would support the Confederacy or support the Union. Women in the Civil War. The home front became a world of white women, and children and African slaves. Women assumed new duties, managing households and farms, raising funds, and volunteering as nurses. Women were farmers, plantation managers, clerks, musician plant workers, and school teachers. Over 20,000 women served as nurses or other health-related volunteers. And I want to mention two here. One is Dorothea Dix. She was the first superintendent of women nurses for the United States, and later she would be a reformer of the nation's insane asylums. The other is Clara Barton. She oversaw the distribution of medicines to Union troops and helped found the American Red Cross. 400 women disguised themselves and fought in the war. Some served as spies. Some assisted the army in cooking meals, writing letters, and assisting with amputations. And that's not even mentioning those who became camp followers. The war took toll on families. The number of widows, spinsters, and orphans mushroomed because of the Civil War. A widow, someone who lost a husband in the war. A spinster, someone who lost a fiancé in the war. According to poet Emily Dickinson, many women looked upon the war with a chastened stare. Religion in the Civil War. Both sides thought they were fighting a holy war. There were the clergymen both in the North and in the South, Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Jewish. They all saw the war as a religious crusade. Bishop Leonidas K. Polk believed enough in the Southern cause to fight in it for the Confederacy. He became known as the Fighting Episcopal Bishop, as he became a general leading the army in a Western theater. And keep in mind, church attendance on Sunday was mandatory. Both sides exhibited public religious expression. Both Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln proclaimed several days of fasting and prayer in the aftermath of important battles. Here in the Civil War lies the origins of Memorial Day, the idea of setting aside a day to take care of the nation's dead. Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, added the words, "In God we trust," to the coins. Every regiment had an ordained chaplain. Devotional services were held weekly and were well attended. Over 1,300 clergymen served the camps. Most of the clergymen were Methodist. In 1862, revivals swept through both armies. Back home, lay women assumed responsibility for services. African Americans saw the war as a recapitulation of their biblical exodus. In the areas held by the Union, free slaves created their own churches. The question is, with regards to religion in the Civil War, is whose side is God on anyway? The Southerners were perplexed by the changing tide of the battle, because religious leaders would explain that military defeats were just God's way of chastening and purifying Southerners. President Lincoln suggested that God's divine purpose might be something different than just simple victory or simple defeat. When he wrote, "Both may be and one must be wrong, God cannot be both for and against the same thing at the same time." Financing the Civil War. The North financed the war by raising taxes, printing paper money, and borrowing cash. They passed the moral tariff on imports. Without Southerners in play, they could raise the tariff on manufactured goods. They raised taxes on manufacturers and nearly every profession. Congress passed the Internal Revenue Act that created an Internal Revenue Service to implement an income tax. But this early income tax, was not quite effective. Congress also passed the Legal Tender Act of 1862, in which Congress authorized $450 million in paper currency to be created by the Treasury. This paper currency is called greenbacks because of the bill's color. They used green ink. These bills were not redeemable in gold or silver, but backed by the trust in the United States government. This did two things. One, at the time, it prevented rampant inflation in the North during the Civil War. Second, it laid the foundation for the future, because this is how our money is based today, not in gold and silver, but on the faith of the United States government. Government bonds. sold by the U.S. government generated $2 billion in revenue. Investors like Jay Cook got wealthy this way. The war itself and the related expenditures from the war helped promote the capital accumulation that was needed for future expansion. And in many ways, the fortunes of many entrepreneurs that you will meet in the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, their fortunes begin here in the Civil War. And for the Confederacy, their finances are an absolute disaster, which is a shame because the Confederacy had more millionaires before the war than in the North. But most of the South's wealth is tied up in slaves. The Confederate Congress passed a national property tax of 0.5% that should have produced revenue, but the Constitution allowed the states of the Confederacy to administer the levying process. So the tax was passed, but not collected. By 1863, the Confederate Congress was taxing almost anything, and I suspect they would have taxed for air if they could have gotten away with it. All in all, national accounting for the Confederacy raised 5% of their revenue from taxes, less than 35% from selling bonds. Treasury notes made up the rest, about 66%. The Confederacy cranked out the printing presses. They printed over $1 billion in Confederate cash. This sparked steep inflation. Now, granted, increasing the money supplies tremendously doesn't help, but neither does the inability to get things. Lincoln's naval blockade does work. Politics during the Civil War. We'll begin with the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens. Davis from Mississippi, Stephens from Georgia. They were elected for 6-year terms in 1861. Neither faced a re-election contest. In fact, Jefferson Davis wasn't allowed. He was only allowed one term. In 1863, Davis put down the Richmond bread riot. He did this by threatening to shoot the protesters. By 1863, the Confederate Congress contained many Jefferson Davis critics, as many ex-Whigs and other opponents of secession were elected, as the war was not going well for the Confederacy. Truth is, Davis's biggest challenge was that the Confederacy as a nation had embraced two things that don't go together: secession and states' rights. The states of the Confederacy guarded their rights as zealously against the Confederate government as they had against the United States government. Once Jefferson Davis imposes a draft, so that states' rights advocates question it. They also question national taxes on things like produce. And Davis also suspended the writ of habeas corpus. States questioned that as well. Truth be told, Davis has tremendous leadership shortcomings. First problem, he doesn't have support. In particular, he doesn't have the support of his vice president. Davis, you see, before the war, Davis was a Democrat. Stephens was a Whig. In fact, at one point, Vice President Stephens said that President Davis was creating a government of military despotism. And then after dropping that mic, Stephens went home to Georgia, and he sulked for 18 months. The real problem, though, is Davis is an ideologue with a temper. Once Davis made a decision, it was made. Now keep in mind, we praise George Washington for this. But here, we vilify Davis because we assume while Washington was creating things, Davis is watching things being destroyed. In fact, one Southern politician said Jefferson Davis was as stubborn as a mule. I want to thank you for watching this video on the first part of A Nation Divided. And I also want to encourage you to watch part 2 of A Nation Divided. And as always, may the Force be with you.